Welcome everyone. So I just wanted to record this section of our book club session 1 that focused on the decoding, the history and decoding section in Christopher Such's book, The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading. So I hope that you, if you've started reading this, I hope you are enjoying it as much as I really enjoy this book. And if you haven't read it yet, I hope you look forward to it. I do think this is such a great book, especially if you are new to the science of reading and you're just thinking about, what does this look like in my work? What is that practicality piece? I think Christopher Such does such a great way of navigating how we can align research with what we are actually doing in the classroom as teachers, that practicality piece, the application piece. With nice, short, succinct chapters, so it's not too overwhelming. And if you have a depth of knowledge around the science of reading, which I know many of you do, I'm sure you are like me, you still read whatever you can get your hands on. And for myself, I do find that, with the various authors that you read from, they're pulling different pieces and looking at things just a little bit differently sometimes, and there's always just something new that you can continue to learn and build on your knowledge. I do want to extend my deepest gratitude to Alicia at Dyslexia Canada. We had started talking about how we could connect Saskatchewan educators and leaders through the science of reading, knowing that there are people doing this work, sometimes in a silo in their own classroom, sometimes in their own school, without maybe the support of their full division. And we wanted to let Saskatchewan know you are not alone. And there are a lot of us that are interested in doing this work, and it's important that we don't feel like we're doing it on our own, and that we can look to other people for conversations, advice, how we can navigate certain things if somebody's already done that. So we did start talking about this probably last summer, and I do want to thank Alicia and Sandra for all of their work in doing this alongside and supporting the registration process, the advertising, and all of that work. We could definitely not have done it without their support. And welcome to all of you outside of Saskatchewan, because we know there are many of you out there, and we follow you on Twitter. And just thank you so much for joining us as well, because this isn't just a provincial thing. We need to extend this and think about how we are building the capacity of classroom teachers, but also supporting, in the end, what we want to do is support all of our students across the country in their literacy development. As a teacher of reading, or as a leader in a school or a division, essentially I think our work centers around teaching all students to read. And a common narrative from educators is that we weren't taught how to teach reading well. We didn't get this learning in our teacher preparation programs. Maybe your school directives or the professional learning offered by your school or your school divisions have centered around some of those more ineffective practices. But we can learn how to teach reading effectively, whether that is to beginning readers, if you are pre-K, K grade 1, maybe grade 2 teachers, or even to more advanced readers in the middle years, or even those, advanced readers in your classrooms, and those who seem to struggle with reading. So we know how we can support these students. So if you are new to this work, I just want to encourage you to take all of this in, learn, but think about what are some small shifts that you can make in your practice, even now until the end of the year. Don't wait until the fall. We can start now, and know that you'll continue to build and grow as you continue to learn. I do want to introduce myself. My name is Andrea Dunk. I am a lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan. I teach the 2 required literacy courses and in the elementary ed program, as well as I have done some graduate level courses as well. And I am a coordinator of Tier 2 supports learning supports at Saskatoon Public Schools. My co-facilitator is Chad Williams, and he is also a lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan and a classroom teacher with Prairie Spirit School Division, and he will be leading the next session. This is a timeline. It doesn't start at the very beginning, obviously, of how reading instruction has changed over the course of the years, but it just highlights where we are coming from and thinking about what resonates with you. Where do you see yourself as a learner when you were going to school? What was sort of that method of reading instruction? Where might you be? Where did your career start? Where, if you have children of your own, how were they taught reading? So you'll probably be able to see yourself in some of these areas as I go through them. Early on, really for a long period of time, reading instruction was characterized by the look-say method or the whole word method. And essentially, you were taught 30 to 50 sight words, just memorize them, and then you were reading books that consisted largely of those particular words, and then any unknown word was accompanied by a picture so that you were to guess that word. And so the main purpose really of this type of instruction was to drill the sight words. I do want to highlight, though, that there were questions already, I mean, even before this, but starting, the science of reading and people thinking about how we teach reading effectively isn't new. It's not just what's happening right now. So back in 1955, Rudolf Flesch said, he published a book called Why Johnny Can't Read and What We Can Do About It, What You Can Do About It. And in it, he said, this is not the way we learn to read. We don't guess. And we don't learn to read words as whole units or whole words. And he said that this is so ineffective that he actually encouraged parents to teach their own children to read instead of how they were doing it in schools. We also see the work of Jean Chall coming out. And she published a book called Learning to Read, The Great Debate, and talked about that initial fear of, what was being perpetuated at the time, that teaching students the code, the letter-sound relationships, would just, produce word callers, produce students who could read a lot of words but not read for meaning. And she said that's actually unfounded. So she was talking about that back in the late 60s. But as well, we also have someone named Ken Goodman who said, he published What's Whole in Whole Language at around the same time, and his claim was that learning to read was actually very natural. It was just like learning to speak. We would just come to it as we do speech. They will discover those relationships if they are exposed to them enough. So then when we move to the 70s, we now see some phonics instruction happening in schools, but this was really characterized by kind of that phonics workbook. This is where I see myself as a learner with the plaid covered workbook. We also see a lot of research starting to happen in the 1970s. When we move now to the 90s, and here we see that huge influence from Ken Goodman with his whole language approach. And so here we're seeing that, very meaning-centered. Children just need to be exposed to high quality literacy. So you will read to them, you will just surround them with words and surround them with books, and they will learn to read. At this time in 1990, Marilyn Adams published a book called Beginning to Read, which is similar to Jean Chall's work back in the late 60s, where she synthesized the research and came to the same conclusions, that phonics was absolutely necessary, and that what was happening with the whole language approach was not it was not supportive of reading development. So we come to the year 2000 when the National Reading Panel had done a meta-analysis, so a study of studies, and they determined that there were 5 essential components to becoming a proficient reader, and that was phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And so there was some we're kind of hearing a lot about the National Reading Panel report now, 23 years later, but there was some recognition then, okay, that yes, okay, maybe some phonics instruction, we see it from Chall's work and from Flesch and from Adams, and now the National Reading Panel. And so these whole language proponents were sort of like, okay, well, we will teach phonics, but only as necessary. So we're not going to teach a lot of it. We're not going to teach it systematically. It'll be very incidental, just as needed. And so there's that philosophical understanding of balanced literacy, where I'm still really whole language, very, I'm immersing my students in very authentic reading tasks with a sprinkle of phonics. However, there isn't a recognized definition of balanced literacy. So others, if you said, what does balanced literacy mean to you? Others might suggest that it's more of that instructional piece where, my balanced literacy approach consists of shared reading, guided reading, independent reading, choral reading. So, we see that resonating through the Saskatchewan curriculum, where it talks about that, highlights that that's the type of instructional approaches that you should have in your classroom. We do see here also that brain imaging starts to really come to life, and a lot of that work comes from Stanislas Dehaene, and he wrote a book called Reading in the Brain, The New Science of How We Read. And so he essentially mapped out precisely what happens in the reading brain. So there's strong evidence from the brain imaging that reading is actually not natural, as Goodman posited, but rather that humans are born with we aren't born with a reading brain. We're not born with the neural connectivity that is required to map, letters to sounds. And so we actually need to build that in our students. And so now we are, we've come to the science of reading. And I do want to highlight that even though it's at the end of the timeline here, like as in present, that this research has been ongoing and will continue to go. Research is continuing to move us forward and will continue to inform our instruction and our practice. And so what we believe now, may have some shifts and changes as new research emerges. But there is also really compelling, strong evidence for some of these core pieces that we know, are essential, and really those won't change. So what the science of reading is not. It is not a philosophy or an ideology. So when we think about balanced literacy or whole language, those were approaches or philosophical understandings. Ken Goodman thought this was how reading developed. He thought that it developed naturally. And so, it wasn't based on research or evidence. And so that is not the science of reading, though. Science of reading is not what somebody thinks about reading. It is actually what research demonstrates. It is not a fad or a pendulum swing. So I often hear teachers say, if they've been in the game for a long time, they'll say, oh, when I started teaching, it was phonics, and then we went to no teaching phonics and whole language and balanced literacy, and now we're back to teaching phonics, and we're going to go back and change something again in 10 years. And it's not the case. So yes, science or the research continues to inform. So we will have to continue to examine and analyze and interpret that research and how it applies to classroom practice. But think about it as moving forward, just like in the medical field. I don't want a surgeon who is going to use practices that are from 40 years ago. I want somebody who is aware of and knowledgeable around the most current practices. And, I want the medical field to continue to learn and grow as well and develop. It's not one size fits all. So what you do with your classroom this year, with those students that you have, those actual bodies in your classroom, and how they are as readers, will inform your teaching, and that might not be exactly the same as what happens next year. So as an example, you might teach grade 1, and with grade 1 students, we know that most of them, or many of them, come to us at the beginning of grade 1 with very limited knowledge of word reading. So they might know alphabet, they might know sounds, but how those actually contribute to, how they read words on the page, that's something that we teach them in grade 1. But when we think about the language, the contribution of language, many of our students will have very strong language. They will have strong vocabulary. They will be articulate. They will have an understanding of language. So when I talk to them, they know what it means. They, will have their life experiences that have given them, already, a broad knowledge base that they continue to then learn and grow and develop. So I know I need to teach a lot or spend a lot of time supporting them in the development of those word recognition skills. I'm still going to develop their language skills, but I don't need to maybe devote as much instructional time there because I know that they're coming in with strengths in those areas versus a grade 1 class where maybe they have very low language. And I see that, many of my students aren't speaking in full sentences, and they can't seem to hold on to the language when I talk to them in full sentences or complex sentences. They don't have a well-developed vocabulary, and so as well as limited knowledge of letters and sounds and how they work in words. And so I'm going to have to put a lot of emphasis in developing language as well as a lot of emphasis in developing that word recognition. And so how am I going to do that throughout the day? It's not a program, so you cannot buy the science of reading and just teach from it. So there are resources that align closely with what research supports. We will teach in a way that aligns with research, but we do not teach the science of reading. And it is not just phonics, so that is a highly articulated misconception, especially by people that are really holding on to balanced literacy or whole language, saying it's just to focus on phonics, but that is not the case. It talks about all aspects of reading as well as spelling, writing, and even like your instruction. So what it is, this all comes from the Defining Guide, and I'll show you that in a minute. So it's a vast interdisciplinary body of knowledge. So it does not just come from one area of research. It comes from cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, education, special education, linguistics, neuroscience, lots of different fields that are all contributing to this, this body of knowledge. And so it's really interesting because you're getting all of these interested disciplines that are contributing to what we can then do in the classroom. It's been conducted for over 50 years, so not just 50 years, but over 50 years and across the world in multiple languages. So it is not just American and it's not just in English, so we can apply this work. There's a lot of contributing research and evidence that supports how we teach English language learners and students from high poverty. There's just, it extends beyond just, sort of one subset. And it informs how reading and writing develops, how we can instruct to support that development, how we can effectively assess that and teach it, and also why some students have difficulties and how we can support them. So again, this all comes from the Reading League created a defining guide just for a shared understanding of what the science of reading is. This is available as a free ebook. You can go online to the Reading League and you can just look at, I think this is under their resources tab, and you can find it and download the free ebook, or you can order, I think it's maybe $9 American or something like that. You can order the actual book. So Christopher Such talks about the simple view of reading, and when we think about theoretical models, this is essentially, one that you will see, over and over if you're ever hearing and learning about the science of reading. And Goff and Tunmer talked about or posited that to have reading comprehension, it's really the product of both word recognition or decoding as well as language comprehension. So word recognition consists of decoding. So if you come across a word, you have the skills to apply to be able to decode the word. We even do this as adults when we read a word that we have never read before. We're going to apply our knowledge to read that word. as well as just that automatic word recognition. So all of those words we can read automatically. So we need to be able to do that. We need to be able to lift those words off the page. We also need to understand what those words mean. And so we need to have an understanding of language. So, meaning, vocabulary, we need to have an understanding of how those words are put together in those particular sentences. And we do all of that and make meaning and draw meaning from the text. You can have deficits in one or both of these areas. So you might have students who have very strong language skills, beautiful vocabulary, are very articulate. If you read a story to them, they would be able to talk about it in a meaningful way. But they have difficulty reading the words. And so they're not going to have strong reading comprehension because they can't read the words well, which is going to compromise that making meaning of the text. You might have students who can read every single word on the page, but don't understand what they mean. They're not making those connections. They're not thinking about, they might be reading and not know what several of those contextual words mean, so they don't have an understanding of the text. And so that strength in word recognition is not going to compensate for that weak language skill. So we need to build up their language so that they can draw meaning from the text when they read it. This is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, and essentially she applied that simple view of reading. So language times word recognition equals skilled reading or reading comprehension. And she outlines in each of these strands what contributes to each. So thinking about what contributes to developing that strong understanding of language and what contributes to being able to accurately and automatically read the words off the page. And this shows development over time. So when we get those readers in grade 1 who are just learning how to do this work, you can see that these strands are very loose. And then as they develop in proficiency in skilled reading, then they really start to intertwine and work together. And that happens over time. I've heard a couple different pieces or shared understandings that skilled reading where it starts to get more tightly woven. I've heard that happens really more in like grade 4 or 5. And then I've also heard some experts in these fields say that this happens sort of mid to late grade 2. There's no set grade level. Again, it's going to depend on what students bring to the work and how easy or difficult it is for them, and also that instruction that they are receiving. And so can we say, they will all be, tightly woven by grade 2? No, but know that, we do want a lot of that integrated work where all of these skills are working together as early as possible so that they are having less difficulty as they get older. So the human brain, I mentioned this before, it was never born to read. Our brain was not born to read. We can see this. We can see in studies or imaging that our brains do not have the connectivity between the different areas that are associated with reading. So how do we learn to read then? Well, essentially, we need to think about our instruction. We need to create the environment for students to build those connections between the different areas of the brain. It's hard work, it's difficult work for the teacher and for the student, but we can do this in a really meaningful and engaging and fun way. So I'm not going to get into that, but I do encourage you, if you want to learn more about that, Carolyn Strom has a great webinar called Cortex in the Classroom. You can search for it on YouTube. She talks about this work and the areas of the brain associated with reading in a very educator-friendly way. So she talks about Meaning Mountain and Vision Valley and Sound City and how those connect and how we can teach to build those connections. If you want to talk about this work with your students, because it's important that students know that they are changing their brains and that is hard work. Amplify has a Brain Builders series with short little videos that follow this little character as he learns about how his brain is changing as he is learning to read. And that is difficult for him. It's hard work. So it just honors for those students that are really struggling, it honors the struggle. So I talked about how the science of reading can inform us on, not just what we need to teach, like the 5 pillars, but also how we need to teach. And we know from research that there are, these 3 really important instructional moves that we can make that are really going to support the development, especially of those word recognition skills, but also, this applies to vocabulary and comprehension as well. But our instruction needs to be explicit, which means we are teaching them and we are directly modeling them and we are providing corrective feedback immediately. And we are providing opportunities for students to engage in purposeful practice to develop that automaticity and accuracy in these skills so that they are developed to mastery. So there's that automatic retrieval. Kids don't even have to think about it anymore. And so if we think about sort of a common structure in our classrooms like Daily 5, and we think about how much time we spend and devote to Daily 5 in a day, so whether it's, a 30-minute, a 50-minute, a 100-minute block, how much time are the students not with the teacher? It would be the majority of the time. So even if you are pulling small groups during that time, you might see a group of students for 10 to 15 minutes, but the entire rest of that time, they are not getting corrective feedback. They are not getting any support from the teacher that is going to support them if they are practicing wrong, that's going to develop their skills. And so we have to rethink, is that structure or that routine supporting the development of reading in my classroom? And I would say no. In early years, that's not a strong instructional routine to have in place because there is just too much time that students are independent or with a partner. You can't have, how are 2 6-year-olds supporting each other in their development? I would question that. And I've done it. I've done it as a grade 1 and 2 teacher. I used Daily 5, and I read that book every single year and tried to implement that work with fidelity and had my kids building stamina. But they're not readers yet. And I mean, they developed into readers over the course of the year, but I was not providing, that really explicit instruction to the students, and the students who struggle need that instruction the most. So we also need systematic instruction, and so that means that we have these really strong routines. So thinking about a phonics lesson, are you incorporating, the visual, the auditory drills, the introduction of the new skill, applying it to the word, doing dictation, applying it to connected text? Is that routine the same each time you do a phonics lesson so students know that routine and can focus on the content and the learning? And also building in that cumulative review so that you're giving students that opportunity for retrieval. And then the instruction, the content needs to be developed sequentially. So easier skills, then you're moving to more complex, harder skills that can then, stick on, Velcro onto those easier skills, and they're continuing to build and build and build. We're not just teaching these skills incidentally all over the place. Dr. David Kilpatrick talks about the connection between phonological awareness and phonics or decoding. So I'll go through that. So we might see this in pre-K and K, where we're, just having the students become aware of the sounds in our language. And so we're thinking, we're engaging the students in rhyming songs and nursery rhymes, and we're asking them to identify the first sound and alliteration, and we're clapping syllables. And then when we apply that to learning, the letters, we're talking about, well, actually all of those sounds we're playing with are represented by those squiggly forms, and those forms are letters, and they have names and they have sounds. And so all those sounds we hear, this is the letter that represents that sound. And then we would move to more basic phonemic awareness, orally blending and segmenting, and then I can see that through that phonic decoding and spelling or encoding. And so when my students are reading a word, they are applying their letter sound knowledge, but also their ability to segment those sounds and then blend them together to read the word, and the opposite when they're encoding. So they're thinking of the word that they want to write, then they have to segment it in their head and then represent that, those letter sounds that they're hearing with the letter representation. We would move to more advanced phonemic awareness where we'll see some manipulation, addition, deletion, substitution, and then we see more of that orthographic mapping where they're able to store larger sequences of letters and words for that automatic retrieval. And Wiley-Blevins looks through now how we connect phonics to comprehension. And so when we think about phonics instruction, that explicit instruction is going to improve decoding. So the ability to apply that knowledge to a word that I don't know automatically. And then after I have that successful decoding, sometimes a couple times, sometimes many, many times, then that connects to my long-term memory and mastery, and then I'm able to automatically read that word the next time I see it, which builds on my reading fluency, which then frees up that cognitive space to really think about and make meaning from the text that I'm reading. If we go back to the kinds of texts we use and we think about that history of reading instruction, let's focus on whole language. So we're using, authentic texts. Again, I'm reading aloud, and Goodman would have said that, just by reading aloud and surrounding them with these great books, they will eventually learn how to read and just, discover these connections themselves. When we move to balanced literacy, we have more of a focus on leveling systems, whether they're numbers or letters. And we might be pulling groups based on our assessments and thinking about, I'm going to pull all my letter, my L's together and work on this, or all of my 17s and work on this. And so we see more of that. And I definitely did this as a teacher in both my instruction and what I encourage my students to take home for home reading. As we move into the science of reading, we're really looking at the importance of putting kids' texts in front of students that are going to support the development of that orthographic mapping. So I've taught them these skills. Now I want them to apply it in practice. And so I want books that contain those skills in a controlled way so that they can practice what we've taught and build some of that automaticity and accuracy in that, and then again layer on those more complex skills. And so I'm introducing books with more complexity as I'm teaching. And so these are typically called decodables, but really any text is decodable once you can read it. And so a more maybe appropriate word for them are controlled texts, because they are controlled for the skills that you have taught. This doesn't mean that I'm not reading those great authentic texts to my students or having them listen to them, but I'm reading them aloud to the students. And we're talking about them and building vocabulary and knowledge through that. But those aren't the texts that I'm having my students, try to practice reading, because the words and the words and the phonics skills are just too complex. So if we take a look at that, this is a typical level A book. And let's just look at the complexity and ask ourselves, what do we notice about these words and what do we notice about the pictures? So the pictures are very much there to support that word recognition. We have some high frequency words that I would have to just teach because they don't have the phonics skills to know these. This is a level A, so I might be giving this to a student at the end of kindergarten or grade 1, beginning of grade 1. I've got some multisyllabic words here. Motorcycle, the C has 2 different sounds. I've got an R-controlled vowel. I've got Y saying, the I sound instead of the Y sound that I would typically teach first. Just a really complex word. So there's no way my kids are going to decode this word. They're going to guess this word based on the picture. And many of them would read this as, you probably can say it, look at the motorbike and not motorcycle. So I'm definitely encouraging my students here to just guess and use the pattern to reinforce. So I know that the next sentence is going to say, look at the. I don't even have to actually turn the page or read it. I know that that's what it's going to say, and then I can look at the picture to say the last word. Versus a decodable or a controlled text where the picture is there to support meaning, it's not there to support word recognition. And you can see that in this particular one, the only vowel sound a child would have to know is the ah sound. Every word is decodable. I think there's, 4 consonant sounds and 1 vowel sound. If you would like to do some more professional reading, this might be on your summer list, but based on these topics, Anita Archer's book, Explicit Instruction, is fantastic. Dr. Kilpatrick's book, Equipped for Reading Success, is a great read to get you thinking about phonological awareness and its relationship to orthographic mapping. Wiley Blevins has a great book. This is kind of that K-3 fresh look at phonics. And if you are a middle years teachers, he's got a book, Word Study in the Intermediate Grades or something like that. That's also very excellent if you're thinking about phonics. I would also highlight, if you have not read this, you need to read it. The Right to Read Executive Summary is available for download on the website, but you can also read the entire document online, and this is just essential in thinking about all of the work that we do. Literacy as a human right. You need to think about the recommendations that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has put in this report for classroom teachers as well as schools and leaders. Again, this is one of the very first things that you should be doing. For those of you in Saskatchewan, know that the work done in Ontario by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, this Right to Read report has influenced an inquiry that is actually happening with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission at this time. And so I really look forward to what happens through that work as we think about how we are supporting all of our students to develop as readers in our province as well. This you probably won't be able to see. I don't know that this video will come out in time, but this film, The Right to Read, is another great film. So if outside of this window you do get a chance to ever watch it, then I would encourage you to do that as well. We did have some breakout times. Move past that. And I just wanted to conclude, this quote by Louisa Moats that says that informed teachers are our best insurance against reading failure. While programs are very helpful tools, programs don't teach, teachers do. What I often hear from teachers who are shifting into this work is they want something, they want a resource, they just want something that they can use and do, and I understand that. And that it can be helpful. However, if you do not have the knowledge of how to use the resource in a responsive way with your students, how to supplement the resource if you find that there are pieces that are missing that your students need, how you might need to be flexible in how you are moving through that resource. Do your students need more repetition? So do you need to go back? Are they progressing quickly and you can move forward? You need to have the knowledge so that you can use resources effectively. And you can use, you might be in a school where you have to use certain resources that might not necessarily be aligned with a lot of the research, but if you have a depth of knowledge, you know what's missing and how you can supplement and maybe, try to make that resource more effective, and what you can do then to use that to support your students in a good way. So I think that's why we are all here. We want to continue to develop our knowledge. So I want to thank you for that. Our next session is on Tuesday, March 21st. We tried to pick different days of the week so that if you're busy doing something every Monday, you're not going to miss every session. So hopefully that will work from 7 to 8 Saskatchewan time, Central Standard Time, and we will look at part 3 in Such's book based on language comprehension. And again, our guest presenter will be Chad Williams from Prairie Spirit. Thanks, everybody.